If you've played any fighting game before, you know that you must deplete your opponent's life bar, and to do so, you need to attack. Most people can safely agree that it is much more difficult to defend than attack in Tekken, at least at an intermediate level, since you can't just crouch block and wait for jump-ins/overheads. There is also such an excessive amount of knowledge that only the real experts know what to expect and how to dismantle an oppressive offense. This leads to more savvy newbies to quickly realize that the best bet is to just be unrelenting in their offense. The problem with this approach is you are going to eventually run into players who can interrupt your stream of attacks and punish you hard. So what happened? Why can't we just mash our way through these ranks like we did before? I'd like to introduce you to a concept called frame data. Say you're smacking your attack inputs and sometimes it works and sometimes you get hit. There are a few factors at play here, but the main one we're going to cover are the frames of the attack. Initially, I had my script go into all the intricacies of frames and why they're used and how they work, but I realized it would just be several minutes of information which would make things more confusing and bloated for newer players. So I'm going to simplify things. I'll link an in-depth explanation if you want it. In video games, we use frames as a measurement of time, and specifically in Tekken, there are 60 frames per second. In pretty much every scenario, 10 frame is the quickest move your character has, and is usually tied to your one jab or your crouch jab. Now say we have a slower move such as Katarina's hop kick. I know that this move is 15 frames in speed, so if I was to hit jab and Katarina were to hop kick at the same time, I would complete my jab 5 frames before the end of her attack, meaning it would interrupt her and lead to a counter hit. If you have primary school math, you can calculate which of any two moves should land first if you've done them at the same time and in neutral. Say we have a 12 frame move versus a 19 frame move. The 12 frame move is 7 frames faster. 15 versus 11, the 11 frame move is 4 frames faster. Now if we go back to my jab versus hop kick example, if Katarina were to hop kick and I waited a little bit, 6 frames to be exact, then tried to use my 10 frame one jab, Katarina would successfully hop kick me. It makes sense, right? Since I waited 6 frames to interrupt her, I would have to have used a 9 frame move, which unfortunately I do not possess. When you are just moving around and not interacting with your opponent, you can assume that you have a frame value of 0 frames. Let's keep this in the back of our minds whilst we continue. If we check our pay to win mechanic of frame data in game, or we use RB Norway, Tekken Chicken, or whatever your application of choice is, when we successfully land this one jab on the opponent, it comes up with a nice little +8. Remember how our character has a value of 0 frames initially? Now they are +8. This means we regain control of our character 8 frames sooner than our opponent does. Okay, so we hit our opponent with the one jab, and now a +8. And now as soon as we can, both my opponent and I hit our 10 frame attack. Our 10 frame strikes the opponent whilst he only gets 2 frames deep into the animation. Now if we do this until the end of the round, we would interrupt his 10 frame at its 2nd frame every single time, leading us to get a perfect. Now because the 10 frame is a bit cheeky and is even +1 on block, we're going to swap it out and find a 13 frame move that leaves us negative on block. Kazumi has a 13 frame attack in the form of down forward 1. This is a great move because not only is it only 3 frames slower than one of the fastest moves in the game, it's also a mid. While being a great move, it is -3 on block if we don't go into any of the extensions, which means we regain control of our character 3 frames slower than our opponent does. So if we were to try and use our down forward 1 again, whilst our opponent tried to use a generic 15 frame hop kick as soon as possible, we would be interrupted just before our second down forward 1. So now the hidden counter for your character makes a little more sense. Some moves will put you in a negative state, meaning you act that many frames after your opponent does, and some moves will put you in the positive state, meaning you act that many frames before your opponent. This is known as frame disadvantage and frame advantage. Sometimes you're so negative that your opponent can strike you before you can even block. This is a punish. In almost every scenario, you can be punished from -10 frames or worse, meaning that they can utilize a move of the same frame startup to strike you, as long as you are within range. If your opponent uses a move which leaves them -13 on block, you can use any move up until 13 frames to punish them. This is why you'll see a lot of character guides stress character punishment and what to utilize, since it is kind of a big deal through all ranges of skill. Now you may notice that there are a combination of buttons that you can slap together that will give you a series of attacks, which is known as a string in Tekken, such as Lee's 2-1-1. The first two hits are what is known as a natural string, as in you cannot escape the combo after the first hit, but the third hit can be defended against. What some optimistic players may have tried to do is interrupt the third hit, since well, we can block, why can't we interrupt it? Let's say we're defended the first two hits, the frame data indicates that Lee is -5, and the third hit is on its way. Well, let's jab him, since Lee hasn't got anything faster than 10 frames. You see, strings make frame data an extra step of annoying to explain and understand. And now I'm no game designer, but at a glance, it looks like they cancel the end lag of the -5 frames that Lee would experience and transition into the third hit instead. Some strings are actually so slow that partway you can interrupt them or do other things. This is something you'll have to experience when you come across that green rank Alyssa. And unfortunately, it's something you'll also have to play around with. As a general rule of thumb, try to focus on blocking or safe backdashing out of strings. See if you can parry a low after blocking, or maybe see if you can sidewalk, and then last, possibly if you can, dick jab. Okay, so now that I somewhat tricked you into learning frame data, how do we use it? You can see why plus on block moves would be so valuable, because even if the opponent did as much as they could and defended against it, you can still act first, allowing you to continue your offense. Now I could go out there and say, spam all those plus on block moves, and in the case of your one jab, I highly encourage you to do so. But most plus on block moves are either so slow or they're gated. So how else can we use this frame knowledge? Remember the down forward one I was talking about with Lee? Well, it complements the one jab quite well, because if I'm getting a little bit too liberal with my jab usage, my opponent may try to high crush. Now 13 frames is a good speed for a mid. There are some quicker ones, but is generally the quickest and safest option your character has. Another wonderful thing about down forward 1 is that not only can you check your opponent by restricting them to quicker moves than your down forward 1, but it also helps you build offense since it's +5 on hit, at least for Lee's case. That means we can go all the way up until 15 frames before we start trading with our opponent. Sometimes you can still convert off a traded launcher, meaning it may be still worthwhile to go for even if you know your opponent is going to try to interrupt. It can be quite difficult to use those 20 frames or so moves in the neutral due to fears of being interrupted, but when you're plus, you reduce the amount of options your opponent has, allowing you to more safely gamble on those moves. I always treat my attacks as stepping stones to alternative attacks. When I jab an opponent and they block it, I'm thinking about what I can use that extra one frame to my advantage, such as maybe jabbing again to gain a +8 frame for an uninterruptible hop kick, or maybe if I can go for a 2-2-3 counter hit launcher if they suspect I'm going to go for a slower attack. Now, as much as I and the rest of us like to complain, the game is really balanced, and the developers for the most part have created an ebb and flow of attacks having pros and cons. Attacks which are both quick and powerful normally have horrible block frames or ending lag. Attacks that crush are normally worse off in the frame department than their non-crushing counterpart. Moves that are quick and safe on block are normally pretty low in damage and mainly used for poking. And then you have moves which do it all, like the electric. Use the 10 frame as a baseline. Any plus frames required should be valued against this 10 frame limit, as having plus 2 means you can go all the way up to 11 frames without being interrupted, and 12 frames if you want to trade. This will also help you understand why if you're mid-match and you want to check if you can punish your opponent's attack, your 10 frame should be used to see if it's possible. Before I go, I should highlight an abnormality which often occurs after these ballerina stuns, in which even though say you're plus 13 frames, that doesn't mean you get a free 13 frame move to use, but if you do pretty much anything and they do anything but block, they'll get hit. Just something I thought I'd bring up, since the Tekken devs like to make things a little more difficult for some reason. Frames are not as scary as you may have first thought. Honestly, the quicker you grasp them, the quicker you'll be abusing that knowledge and destroying people online who don't know their power. Find your quick and safe moves and use them often. Find what moves allow you to incorporate your slower and stronger moves more naturally during combat. Find those key punishes for your character so you don't get bullied by online warriors. Oh, and before I leave, Yoshimitsu has like a 6 frame flash, so good luck with that.